Hello and welcome to today. Oh my god, I have a hair in my mouth. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Hello and welcome to today's video. My name is Kat and we're going to be talking about my top 10 books of 2023. As I said that, I'm hoping that I got the number right. I'm pretty sure it's 10 books, but if it's not, it's just my top books of 2023. So got that covered just in case I messed up. I am so freaking excited to film this video. I definitely waited for a little bit because I was kind of holding out hope that I would find a few more favorites this year, but like you saw in my reading sets video, I actually only read one book in December, so I probably could have filmed this way sooner. But I'm filming it now and I'm just so excited to dive right in. I was trying to look back at some of my notes and not gonna lie, I was missing a lot of them. I clearly don't have a good system for organizing. We are just gonna talk about what I remember, and these were all the books that when I was looking back really stuck out to me or are books that I've just continued to think about throughout the year. Some of them I wasn't really expecting to actually make the cut, but when I was like sitting down and thinking about them, I was like, wait, no, I have to include it. They have to be part of it. So I'm just really excited to talk about all of these. Oh, I was gonna say, this year I feel like wasn't necessarily my best reading year, and I was kind of nervous that I wouldn't have that many favorites, but I was very surprised. There were definitely some books that made the cut. I'm just so glad that I had a list that I could share with you all. I'm not going to do any particular order because that's too much pressure. So I'm actually just gonna go in order of when I read these books and we'll talk about them that way. Less pressure, don't have to decide. Okay, so the first book on my favorites list is Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin. This is my very first Schweblin, my only Schweblin so far. I have not dived into any of her other books. I'm hoping to this winter, but so far this is the only one, and it was so good. So this book is actually translated from Spanish, and it's translated by Megan McDowell, and this was published in 2014. It is a little tiny book, very, very short, and what this book is about is basically we are following, don't remember her name, Amanda. We're following Amanda as she's in the hospital, she's dying, and there's a little boy by her bedside, and that's not her son, and together they're working to try and help her remember what happened that led to her being hospitalized. I read this in one sitting, and I feel like that's probably the best way to go about reading it. There are no chapters, so I feel like that really helps with the flow of things and making you want to just keep reading. I don't know how effective it would be if you read this book over a certain amount of days. I really think this hits the most when you read it in one sitting. So that's how I suggest reading it. It's just like so creepy, and I'm usually a big wimp, but I was able to handle this, and I don't know, I really loved it. It still sticks with me. There's certain scenes that play out in my head. Oh, it was just so good. I don't think I fully knew what to expect from Samantha Schweblin's writing, and I mean, I've only read one book, so I don't really know like her other books at all, but this blew me away. Definitely a favorite. I'm so glad that I read it this year. Okay, up next is The Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante. Okay, this book is translated from Italian, and this was published in 2002, I think. Yes, it was published in 2002. My freaking god. This is the very first Ferrante I've read. It was so good. Okay, so synopsis. It's about this woman named Olga, and her husband are now getting a divorce. It was her husband's choice to file for a divorce, and they've been married for 15 years. So now, is her name Olga? Yes. So now Olga is left kind of picking up the pieces, kind of figuring out like what she's going to do, trying to figure out what happened with their relationship and why it ended. And she also has their 2 children and a dog to take care of. So there's a lot of things to manage. There's a lot of things to think about. This book was such a trip, and unlike Fever Dream, I don't think I recommend reading this in one sitting. I feel like it's so short, and you could, but would you be well after? I don't know. I personally was not well. I feel like I had to take breaks from this book because it was so stressful at times. There's one specific chapter. I will never get that out of my head, ever. It was so stressful. I felt so on edge reading that chapter. For this one, I feel like the writing was so beautiful. It's definitely really intense, so I very much so for all of these books, but like especially this one, make sure to check the trigger warnings, the content warnings to make sure that this is something that you want to read. I do want to make like a small little note that there is something that happens with an animal. Just wanted to give a heads up on that. But man, this book, it's always going to be like a book that whenever I think about, I immediately remember when I was reading it and the feelings that I was feeling. I honestly think it's so rude of me that I haven't read any other Ferrante this year or in 2023. In 2024, I absolutely must, because I want to be in her writing again, just like thinking about it. So glad I got to a Ferrante, and here's hoping I read more in 2024. All right, up next, I feel like this is gonna be no surprise to anyone, but we have The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. Of course, this made my list. I feel like I didn't shut up about this book. Whenever anyone asked me like a favorite book of the year, this was absolutely a standout of the year. Going into it, I thought I was gonna love it, but not as much as I ended up loving it. This book was published in 2018, and it's my very first Nunez. I did not realize how many books Nunez has read. I mean, she's probably read a lot of books, but I didn't realize how many books she's written. So I've got my list to go through for Nunez, and I'm so excited to do that. In this story, we're basically following a woman who has recently lost a friend. He has passed away, and now she has found herself owning his dog. It was kind of just like put onto her, and she lives in an apartment complex where she's not even supposed to have dogs, so that's like an aspect of it, and that's like the general gist of it. But there's like so much more in this book. It's not super long, but I think it's absolutely mind-blowing how Nunez is able to like talk about this topic in the storyline, but then also talk about so many other topics that aren't necessarily related to like the main storyline, and it feels like you kind of go on tangents where you'll be talking about the storyline and then all of a sudden you're like talking about a completely different topic, but then she brings you back to the storyline, and I think that she does that so beautifully. I don't think I've ever experienced that in any other book, so that really stuck with me. I feel like that was the very first time I'd seen anyone do that. So of course, I had to add this one to my list. I don't really want to talk too much about it because I feel like I've talked so much about it, but look, I tabbed so much on this one. It was so dang good. So yeah, of course, The Friend is on the list. Again, I feel like a huge theme. A lot of these authors are new to me authors, and I'm so excited to just read more from them. Okay, and up next, an author that I have already read another book from. It's Miriam Tave's Woman Talking. This was published in 2018, and it is officially my second Miriam Taves. In this book, we're following 8 women that are in a Mennonite community, and they are trying to figure out what they are going to do because they have found out that the men of the community have been attacking the women at night. They've been drugging them up and taking advantage of the women. So they are meeting and deciding, like, what are we going to do? Are we going to leave? Are we going to stay? Are we going to fight? What are our options? This is based off of a real situation that did happen in a Mennonite community. I think it was in Bolivia. Let's see. Okay, yeah. It was in a Mennonite community in Bolivia. So this is based off a true story, and my God, I almost forgot to include this, and part of me was also like, I don't know if it really stuck with me that much, but when I sat down to think about it, it definitely did. I really enjoyed this book so much. It was heavy, but something about the way she wrote it didn't feel like too heavy. She wasn't super descriptive on like what necessarily happened to the women. It was a lot more focused on them talking as a group and coming to the decision of what they were going to do, and everyone kind of putting their input on like what they thought was the best way to go about it. How would they even like deal with being outside of the Mennonite community? So I grew to be really attached to these characters as well. Like there was so much to kind of like grab from each of the characters just by these conversations and how they interacted and the things that they said and the ideas that they had. I am so excited to read more from Miriam Taves. I think she could potentially be a favorite author because last year Fight Night was on my favorites list, and now this year Women Talking is, so we'll see which Miriam Taves book is on my favorites next year because I feel like it's gonna happen. Okay, so up next, I actually don't have this book because I got a copy of it from the library, and it's Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, and this book was published in 2021. This author is another first-time author for me. I have wanted to read Never Let Me Go, but I keep putting that one off, and I was also putting Klara and the Sun off, but I finally got to it this year, and I'm so glad I did. It was so good. I loved Klara as a character. Let me first dive into the synopsis. I'm already like trying to gush about Klara, but basically we're following Klara, who's this AI robot friend, and we're following her as she's in a store waiting to be chosen by a child to be their little AI friend. We are through the eyes of Klara, so we are through this AI robot's point of view, which I personally loved. I loved not really knowing what was going on and kind of learning with Klara as we're following her along, and she's like picking things up and kind of starting to understand them a bit more. So yeah, I just really enjoyed my time with this one, and I feel like I need to own it. So that's another tell for me that this is a favorite, because I'd like to give that one a reread. It was so good, so good. And again, like all these other authors, here's hoping I read more. Ishiguro, I have Never Let Me Go. I also have The Buried Giant and Remains of the Day. So I have options. I need to pick them up. Okay, up next is another book that I don't have the copy for because I listened to it on audio, and it's Greedy: Notes from a Bisexual Who Wants Too Much by Jen Winston. This book was published in 2021, and it's Jen Winston's memoir. We are following Jen as she's just navigating being bisexual and also dealing with the stereotypes that are put on her because she's bisexual. So we're following her, but she, like the first page, I feel like I immediately was laughing. She is so funny. She has such a great way of like retelling her stories, and listening to it on audio I feel like is the best way, just because I'm pretty sure she narrates it if I'm not mistaken. I loved her roommates and the stories that they had to tell. It was just so good, and honestly, I'd love to reread this one. I highly recommend if you haven't read it already. Okay, up next is a book that I also... Oops. You can't look at it yet. It's a surprise. The next book that is on this list, I almost forgot to include, and I would have been so upset with myself if I did. It was Homegoing by Gyasi. My very first Gyasi. I will be reading Transcendent Kingdom after this, absolutely. This was published in 2016, and I think, is this her first? I think it goes Homegoing and then Transcendent Kingdom was the next one that she wrote. I'm sorry if I got those mixed up, but this was so good. I had a whole reading vlog on this one where I woke up at 5 a.m. to read it, and this book kept me awake. I wanted to get up the next day just so I can sit down and read this book because it was so freaking good. We are following two sisters who are born in different villages, and one of the sisters ends up marrying an Englishman, and she lives a very comfortable life, and then the other sister is actually captured and enslaved and arrives at the US. So we're following them, but then we kind of pivot towards the generations that follow. We see several characters' points of view. Like I said, this was one of those books that I did not want to put down. I wanted to keep reading, and her writing was just so captivating. I also thought it was so impressive how many characters she was able to write about and like fully flesh out. I loved it so much. If you haven't read Gyasi, if you haven't read Homegoing, I feel like I'm one of the last to read this book. So if you haven't, I'm here to tell you that you should absolutely read this. It's not too long, and honestly, if she would have made this like a 500-page book, I think I would have kept reading it. Like, I just loved her writing that much. That's all I have to say. I don't know. It was so freaking good. All right, up next is a book that I really did not think would be in my top books. When I read it, I knew of course it was going to be on my list, but going into it, I was like, well, we'll see. I don't even know if I'll finish this book. No, I ended up loving it so much, and it's Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This was published in 2020, and this was so good. For a synopsis, I'm not going to tell you anything. This is one of those books that I feel like everyone always told me, or not told me, it was like in reviews that I watched, they would say like, it's better to not know what it's about, and I couldn't agree more. I think that this is one of those books where you don't need to know what it's about, just pick it up, start reading it, and you'll find your way. I enjoyed this one so much more than I expected. I loved Piranesi as a character. You are basically kind of like thrown into the story, and the very first page I remember reading it and being like, what is going on? Like, what does any of this mean? And as the story progresses, you slowly start to learn a little bit more. So that's all I'll say. I'm so glad that I actually picked it up. I got this copy used, and I really was like, I don't know, I'll get it used, but maybe I should just get it from the library. But I'm so glad that I own it and that I found a used copy, because I loved it. I loved it. And this is also one that I just keep thinking about. So it had to make the list. It had to. So the next book I actually don't have the copy for because I got it from the library, and it is Ripe by Sarah Rose Etter, and this was published in 2023. This is my first Sarah Rose Etter. I haven't read the Book of X by her, so I had no idea what to expect. I remember seeing the cover of it everywhere and not necessarily being like too interested. I didn't really know what it was about to begin with, but one day I just randomly put in a hold for it at my library, and I really enjoyed it. It was so good. We're following our main narrator, and her name is Cassie. She works in Silicon Valley. Her manager sucks, and she's just working so many hours. She's working overtime and putting in so much effort. Also, the world around her is kind of falling apart with events that are happening in the world. There's also a character, I guess you would say, and it's like a black hole that just follows Cassie around. It changes sizes depending on like how she's feeling. If she's feeling a certain type of way, it might be bigger. If she's not, it might be smaller. This is another book that took me by surprise, because going into it, I didn't really know what it was about. I wasn't necessarily too hyped to read it. I just thought the cover was really beautiful, and I had seen other people I knew talk about it, but I loved this book so much. I related to it so hard. Like, there's so many thoughts that she was having that I've definitely had, so I definitely like related to Cassie as a character and how she was feeling about what was going on with work. And I just thought it was so unique, the character of the black hole that kind of like followed Cassie around. There were so many moments that like really stressed me out, just like thinking about what was happening. It could be one of those books that like was the right time, right book, and it just worked really well for me. But I loved it. I really want to read the Book of X now. And I watched Jalen's interview with Sarah Rose Etter, and that just made me love her even more too. So it's going on the list. We are at the final book, my final favorite book of 2023, and this one was so good. So it was Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, and this was published in 2017, and it's there's a hair. My hair is everywhere, apparently. And it was translated from Arabic. If you see that I moved, it's definitely because this is Kat after reviewing what I even covered. There were so many details that I just like left out from the description. This book is separated into two parts. The first half takes place in 1949, which is a year after the Nakba took place, and we are following these Israeli soldiers as they're patrolling. They come across a teenage girl as well as a group of people, and they end up killing the group of people, but they take the girl and they capture her, torture her, and end up murdering her. So that's what happens in the first half. And then in the second half, we follow a woman who is currently living in Ramallah, and she finds out this piece of information about the teenage girl that was murdered, and she comes to find out that the girl was murdered 25 years to the day of this woman's birth, and she becomes really fascinated by this detail and wants to learn more about the girl and what happened. So she's kind of focusing in on that detail. That's the general gist of it. Now we can go back to the video where I was talking about how I feel about it. I listened to this on audio. It's because I was waiting for this book. It was back ordered, so I didn't have my hands on a copy, and the audiobook was so excellent. I feel like I tried reading it once, I wasn't in the right headspace, and then I tried it again, and it was really, really good. Typically I read my books at like 1.5, 1.75 speed, but this one I definitely had to slow it down to kind of like make sure I was absorbing everything that I was reading, because it is such a tiny book. But wow, this book was so haunting. Like, on the back it says, this spare and haunting novel cuts to the heart of the experience of erasure, dispossession, and life under occupation in Palestine, and reveals the difficulty of piecing together the shards of a narrative concealed by a fragmented history. Spare and haunting, like, those are such good words for this. And in the first part, we're following this one specific Israeli, I think he's like, I don't know, the officer, I think that's what they're called, I don't really know, but we're following him, and the author is describing like how he's feeling. He's feeling really sick and feverish, and like some weird stuff is happening. And when I was reading that, I was like, am I sick? I feel sick. I feel like I'm experiencing the same symptoms that she's describing. It was so like eerie. And there's also a lot of repetition in this book in both parts, and you see it happening, and it just like adds to the like eeriness of it, the amount of things that are repeating. I feel like my pea brain can only explain this so much. Like, this is a work of art. This was so well written, and yeah, this one's gonna stick with me for a very long time. I will definitely be rereading this one, and I'm just so glad that I own the copy too. So if you're waiting for your back order, I really hope that this comes in for you, because it's such an excellent read and I highly recommend it. So yeah, this was the last favorite of 2023. We have made it through my whole list. I can't believe it. I honestly didn't think I was gonna have 10 books, so I'm so glad that I was able to put together a list of 10 books that I loved. It was really nice to kind of look back and be like, oh, I did have favorites. There were books that I really enjoyed, because overall my reading year was a little meh. But these were the standouts. These are the ones that I still think about. I would love to know if any of these are also on your list, whether they're on your to be read list or whether they're also on your favorites list. I really hope 2024 is a better reading year for me, for you, if you didn't have a great reading year in 2023. But thanks so much for watching and hanging out with me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.